My name is Clara Hughes, and I'm 73 years old. For most of my life, I believed that family meant everything. I raised 4 children with my late husband Robert in our colonial home on Maple Street, the same house where we celebrated birthdays, holidays, graduations, and where we mourned losses together. I thought I understood what love looked like between a mother and her children. I thought respect was something that grew stronger with age, like fine wine or old oak trees. I was wrong about so many things. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What I'm about to tell you happened 6 months ago, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the people I brought into this world. This isn't a story about revenge, though some might call it that. This isn't about money, though money played its part. This is about what happens when the people you love most decide you no longer matter. This is about the moment I realized that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let go of everything you thought you were saving for. I've lived in the same house for 47 years. The mortgage was paid off decades ago, and every room holds memories that span nearly half a century. My children grew up believing this house would someday be theirs. They talked about it openly, casually, the way you might discuss weekend plans or grocery lists. When we inherit the house, they'd say, as if my death was just another item on their calendar. I used to find it amusing, their certainty. Now I understand it was something else entirely. What happened to me could happen to anyone. Maybe it's happening to someone you know right now. Maybe it's happening to you. The signs start small, almost invisible, like hairline cracks in a foundation. You tell yourself it's nothing, that you're being too sensitive, that family is family, and blood is thicker than water. But sometimes blood runs cold, and sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones you need protection from. The morning I left for my sister Margaret's house in Boston, everything in my world felt secure and predictable. It was a Tuesday in early September, and the autumn light was just beginning to touch the edges of the maple leaves outside my bedroom window. I had been looking forward to this visit for weeks. Margaret, 5 years my senior, had been struggling with her own health issues, and we both knew our time together was becoming more precious. At 78, she moved slower than she used to, and her phone calls had grown shorter, more labored. This visit felt important in a way that settled deep in my chest. I remember standing in my living room that Tuesday morning, taking what I thought would be a casual glance around the space before leaving. The morning sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, illuminating the antique mahogany dining table that had been Robert's pride and joy. He'd found it at an estate sale 35 years ago, back when we were young and had more dreams than money. The table had hosted countless family dinners, homework sessions, and late-night conversations over coffee when the children were teenagers, navigating their first heartbreaks and disappointments. My gaze moved to Robert's leather reading chair, positioned perfectly by the bay window where he could watch the street while enjoying his evening newspaper. The leather had worn soft over the years, molded to the shape of his body during the countless hours he spent there. Even now, 2 years after his passing, I sometimes caught myself looking toward that chair, expecting to see him there with his reading glasses perched on his nose and a cup of tea growing cold on the side table. The china cabinet stood against the far wall, its glass doors reflecting the morning light and revealing the collection of dishes, figurines, and family photographs that told the story of our life together. Wedding china that we'd used only on special occasions, crystal glasses that had been wedding gifts from Robert's parents, and small porcelain figurines that I'd collected over the years from our travels together. Each piece had its place, its story, its significance in the tapestry of our shared history. I had no reason to think this would be the last time I'd see these items in their rightful places. No reason to suspect that the children I'd raised, fed, clothed, and supported through college and early adulthood would view my temporary absence as an opportunity rather than simply time apart. I trusted them implicitly, the way mothers do, with the blind faith that comes from decades of putting their needs before your own. My youngest son, David, had offered to check on the house while I was away. At 38, he lived just 20 minutes across town with his wife Jennifer and their 2 young children. He'd been attentive since his father's death, calling regularly and stopping by on weekends to help with small repairs or heavy lifting. When I mentioned my plans to visit Margaret, he immediately volunteered to keep an eye on things, maybe water the plants and bring in the mail. It seemed natural, responsible, the kind of thing a caring son would offer. My daughter Susan, 42 and living in the neighboring town, had also made casual mentions of stopping by during my absence. She often borrowed things from the house, small items that reminded her of her childhood or that she needed temporarily for her own home. I'd always been generous with such requests, happy to share whatever I had with my children. The house felt too large for just me anyway, and sharing its contents made it feel more alive, more connected to the family it had sheltered for so many years. My older sons, Michael and Thomas, lived further away but stayed in touch with their siblings. Michael, at 45, was the most successful of my children, working in real estate development downtown. Thomas, 43, managed a small construction company that specialized in home renovations. They were good boys, I told myself, men now with their own responsibilities and concerns, but still my sons at heart. The week in Boston passed quickly, filled with long conversations with Margaret about our childhood, our parents, and the friends we'd lost over the years. We looked through old photo albums and shared memories that seemed to grow more vivid with each telling. Margaret's health was more fragile than I'd realized, and by the end of the week, I was grateful for every moment we'd spent together. The visit had been exactly what we both needed, a chance to strengthen the bond between sisters who had weathered decades of life's changes together. The drive home felt longer than usual, perhaps because I was tired from the emotional intensity of the week, or because the September afternoon had turned gray and drizzly. I found myself looking forward to the familiar comfort of my own space, my own routines, the predictable rhythm of life in the house where I'd spent most of my adult years. As I turned onto Maple Street, everything looked exactly as I'd left it. The lawn had been mowed, probably by David, and the newspaper hadn't accumulated on the front porch, which meant someone had been collecting the mail as promised. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment in the car, feeling that particular satisfaction that comes from returning home after time away. The house looked welcoming in the gray afternoon light, its familiar silhouette promising comfort and rest. I gathered my suitcase and purse from the back seat and walked up the front steps, fumbling with my keys at the front door in the way that always happened when I was tired. The front door opened easily, and I stepped into the entryway, immediately, noticing that something felt different. The light seemed to travel further into the house than usual, and there was an echo to my footsteps that hadn't been there before. I set down my suitcase and walked toward the living room, and that's when the world shifted beneath my feet in a way that would change everything that came after. The living room was virtually empty. Robert's reading chair was gone. The mahogany dining table had vanished, along with its matching chairs. The china cabinet no longer stood against the far wall, and with it had disappeared decades of collected memories, photographs, and precious items that told the story of our life together. The Persian rug that had covered the hardwood floor for 20 years was nowhere to be seen. Even the curtains had been removed from the windows, leaving the bare glass to reveal the gray afternoon without any softening or warmth. I stood in the doorway, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The emptiness was so complete, so shocking, that for a moment I wondered if I had somehow entered the wrong house. But the wallpaper was the same. The hardwood floors bore the familiar scratches and wear patterns I knew by heart, and the light switch beside the door was exactly where it had always been. This was my home, but it had been stripped of almost everything that made it mine. My legs felt weak, and I reached for the doorframe to steady myself. The silence in the empty room seemed to press against my ears, and I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick with shock. I walked slowly into the center of the room, my footsteps echoing hollowly against the bare walls. The spaces where furniture had stood were clearly visible on the hardwood floor. Lighter rectangles and squares where the wood had been protected from years of sunlight and wear. I moved through the house like someone in a dream, discovering the extent of what had been taken. The guest bedroom had been cleared of its antique dresser and mirror. The hallway was empty of the small table that had held a lamp and family photographs. Even some of the artwork had been removed from the walls, leaving behind faded rectangles on the wallpaper and small holes where nails had been. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, and I had to try twice before I successfully dialed David's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice cheerful and casual in a way that seemed impossible given what I was looking at. "Hi, Mom. How was your trip? Did you and Aunt Margaret have a good time?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. The normalcy of his greeting seemed to exist in a different universe from the reality of my empty living room. Finally, I found my voice, though it sounded strange and distant to my own ears. "David, where is my furniture?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough for me to understand that this question was not a surprise to him. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted, becoming more careful, more measured. "What do you mean, Mom?" "I mean, my living room is empty. Robert's chair is gone. The dining table is gone. The china cabinet is gone. Where is my furniture, David?" Another pause, and I could hear muffled voices in the background, as if he were covering the phone and speaking to someone else. When he returned to the conversation, his voice had taken on the patient, slightly condescending tone that adults use with children who are being unreasonable. "Mom, we talked about this. You said you were thinking about downsizing, remember? Susan and I thought this would be a good time to help you get started on that process. The furniture was just sitting there, and you're not really using that big dining table anymore, are you?" I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. I had never, not once, mentioned downsizing to any of my children. I had never expressed any desire to get rid of Robert's chair or the dining table or any of the other pieces that had been removed from my home. These were not conversations that had ever taken place. And yet David was speaking as if they were established facts, shared decisions that I had somehow forgotten. "I never said anything about downsizing, David. I never gave you permission to take my furniture." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Where is it?" His voice became firmer, more insistent, as if repetition would make his version of events true. "Mom, you've been talking about how the house is too big for you ever since Dad died. You said you were thinking about getting rid of some of the old furniture. We were just trying to help." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but it became clear that David was not going to acknowledge what had actually happened. According to him, I had requested this help, had been grateful for their intervention, had even helped them decide which pieces to remove. None of this was true, but he repeated these fabrications with such confidence that I began to doubt my own memory, at least for a moment. When I finally hung up the phone, I was shaking with a combination of shock, anger, and something deeper that I couldn't yet name. I called Susan next, hoping for a different explanation, for some version of events that would make sense of what had been done to my home. Susan's response was even more disturbing than David's. She seemed annoyed that I was upset, as if my reaction to finding my home stripped of its contents was an inconvenience to her day. "Honestly, Mom, it was just old furniture. Most of it was worn out anyway, and you know you can't take care of a house this size anymore. We got some money for the pieces that were worth anything, and the rest we donated. You should be thanking us for cleaning up that clutter." Clutter. She had called the furniture that held 4 decades of memories clutter. The chair where her father had read bedtime stories to her when she was small was clutter. The dining table where she had done her homework, where we had celebrated her graduation from college, where she had announced her engagement, was clutter to be disposed of. I tried to explain to Susan what these items had meant to me, but she cut me off with impatience. "Mom, you're being overly emotional about this. They were just things. You can buy new furniture if you want, maybe something more practical for your age." When that conversation ended, I sat in my empty living room and tried to understand what had happened to my family. These were not the children I had raised. The people I had spoken to were strangers wearing my children's voices, strangers who felt entitled to enter my home and dispose of my possessions as if I were already dead, as if my feelings and memories and attachments were irrelevant inconveniences to be brushed aside. I called Michael next, hoping that as the oldest, he might have some explanation, or perhaps hadn't been involved in whatever decision had led to this violation of my home and trust. But Michael's response revealed that this had not been an impulsive decision by his younger siblings. This had been planned, coordinated, and executed with the efficiency of people who had given it considerable thought. "Look, Mom, we've all been worried about you since Dad died. You're getting older, and that house is way too much for you to handle. We thought if we helped you get rid of some of the excess stuff, it might make things easier for you. Maybe help. You see that you don't need such a big place anymore." The presumption was breathtaking. They had decided what I needed, what I could handle, what was excess in my own life. They had entered my home while I was away and removed items that belonged to me, items that held emotional significance they couldn't begin to understand, and they expected me to be grateful for this violation. Thomas, when I finally reached him, was the most honest about what they had done, though his honesty was perhaps more painful than his brother's justifications. "We sold most of it, Mom. Got a pretty good price for Dad's chair and that old dining set. The china cabinet, too. Susan has some of the dishes and things from inside it. Look, you're not getting any younger, and that stuff was just going to sit there until something happened to you. At least this way, the family got some benefit from it. Until something happened to me." He couldn't even say the word death, but that's what he meant. They had treated me as if I were already dead, dividing up my possessions and disposing of my belongings as if I no longer had any say in my own life. The family had gotten some benefit from it, he said, as if I were not part of the family anymore, as if my role had shifted from mother to burden, from person to problem to be solved. After I had spoken to each of my children, I sat alone in my violated home and tried to process what had been done to me. The empty rooms seemed to mock the life I had built, the trust I had placed in the people I loved most. Every bare space, where furniture had stood, was evidence of how little I mattered to them now, how easily they could dismiss my feelings and my rights in favor of their own convenience and financial gain. The house felt different now, not just because it was empty, but because it had been invaded. The security I had felt in my own home had been shattered, along with my trust in my children. They had keys to my house, keys I had given them freely, because I trusted them, because I believed they would use that access to help and protect me, not to rob me of the things that mattered most. As the afternoon faded into evening, I walked through the empty rooms and began to understand that this was not an isolated incident. This was a declaration, a statement about how my children saw me and my role in their lives going forward. I was no longer their mother in any meaningful sense. I had become an obstacle, an inconvenience, a problem to be managed until nature took its course and left them free to inherit what they believed was rightfully theirs. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that I would accept this treatment, that I would be passive and grateful for their intervention in my life. They had assumed that age had made me weak, that grief had made me compliant, that love for them would make me tolerate anything they chose to do to me. They were wrong about all of those things. As I stood in my empty living room that evening, looking at the spaces where my memories used to live, I began to understand that this was not the end of something, but the beginning. My children had taught me something valuable about who they really were, and more importantly, about who I still could be. They had shown me that the love I thought we shared was conditional, dependent on my usefulness to them and my willingness to quietly disappear when I became inconvenient. But I was not ready to disappear. I was not ready to be managed, dismissed, or reduced to an obstacle in their path to inheritance. I was 73 years old, not dead, and I still had choices to make about my own life. Important choices. Choices that would surprise them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The house on Maple Street held 47 years of memories, but it also held something else now. It held the seed of my own rebellion, my own declaration of independence from children who had forgotten that their mother was still a person with rights, feelings, and the power to make decisions about her own future. They had sold my furniture, without permission, treating me like someone who no longer mattered. Soon, they would learn what it felt like to have important decisions made without their input, to discover that the people they thought they could control still had the power. To surprise them, the empty rooms echoed with possibility, and for the first time since Robert's death, I felt something that might have been hope, sharp and bright and entirely my own. That first night alone in my stripped house, sleep came in fragments between waves of disbelief and growing anger. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Robert's empty chair, and every time I opened them, the reality crashed over me again like cold water. My children had entered my sanctuary and systematically removed the physical anchors of my life, as if 47 years of building a home meant nothing more than obstacles to their convenience. I found myself walking through the house at 3. In the morning, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floors that now seemed vast and unfamiliar, without the furniture that had defined each room's purpose and personality. The moonlight streaming through the uncurtained windows created stark geometric patterns on the floor, illuminating the pale rectangles where my belongings had protected the wood from decades of sunlight. These ghost images of my former life seemed to glow in the darkness, accusatory and haunting. In the kitchen, I made coffee with shaking hands and sat at the small breakfast table that had somehow escaped my children's purge, probably because it was too modest, too ordinary to be worth their attention or effort to remove. The ceramic mug felt warm and solid in my palms, one of the few familiar textures remaining in a house that no longer felt like home. As I sipped the bitter coffee, memories began to surface with painful clarity, each one attached to something that had been taken from me. The mahogany dining table hadn't just been furniture. It had been the heart of our family life for 35 years. The steady witness to thousands of meals, conversations, arguments, celebrations, and quiet moments that had woven the fabric of our shared history. I could see it so clearly now, the way the morning light used to catch the grain of the wood, the small scratch near one corner where Michael had been careless with a toy truck when he was 7, the darker ring where Robert always placed his coffee cup during our Sunday morning conversations over the newspaper. That table had been where we gathered for every holiday dinner, where I had served turkey and ham and all the traditional dishes that took me days to prepare because I wanted everything to be perfect for my family. Christmas mornings when the children were small, we would eat breakfast at that table surrounded by torn wrapping paper and the excited chatter of young voices describing their gifts. Easter Sundays, Thanksgiving afternoons, birthday celebrations, graduations, engagements. Every significant moment in our family's life had been blessed and witnessed by that steady, beautiful table. I remembered the afternoon Robert brought it home, how proud he had been of his find at the estate sale. We were young then, in our 30s, still building our life together piece by piece. Money was tight with 4 children and a mortgage. But Robert had seen something special in that table, something that would anchor our family for decades to come. He had spent hours that first weekend polishing it, restoring its deep shine, making it worthy of the role it would play in our home. The children had done their homework at that table every evening after school. I could see Susan, 8 years old with pigtails, struggling with long division while I stirred dinner at the stove nearby. Michael practicing his cursive handwriting, his tongue poking out in concentration as he formed each letter carefully. Thomas building elaborate structures with his Legos, spreading his architectural visions across the smooth wooden surface. David, the youngest, coloring with crayons that he arranged in precise rainbow order before beginning each masterpiece. During their teenage years, that table had been where we held family meetings to discuss curfews, driving privileges, college, plans, and the countless negotiations that come with raising adolescents. It was where Robert and I had helped them with algebra and chemistry and history projects, where we had listened to their dreams and fears and tried to guide them toward the adults we hoped they would become. Some of our most important conversations as a family had happened around that table, the wood absorbing not just the physical marks of daily use, but the emotional resonance of a family growing together through joy and struggle. When the children left for college one by one, that table had become Robert's and mine again. We would sit across from each other in the quiet house, sharing our days over dinner, planning vacations, discussing the books we were reading or the movies we wanted to see. After Robert's diagnosis, when his strength began to fail, that table became even more precious. He would sit there in the mornings, looking out the window at the garden he could no longer tend, and I would join him with coffee and toast, holding his hand across the wood that had witnessed our entire marriage. Now it was gone, sold to strangers who would never know its history, never understand the weight of memory it carried. Susan had called it clutter, as if the decades of love and life it had supported were meaningless debris to be cleared away. The casual cruelty of that dismissal cut deeper than I had words to express. Robert's reading chair had been even more personal, more intimately connected to the man I had loved for 49 years. That chair had been his refuge, his sanctuary, the place where he retreated with books and newspapers, and the quiet contemplation that sustained him through the demands of work and family life. The leather had been rich brown when we first bought it, back when the children were teenagers, and Robert was working long hours to save for their college educations. Over the years, it had mellowed to a warm cognac color, softened by thousands of hours of use and shaped by the contours of his body. I could see him there so clearly now, my memory painting him into the empty space where the chair used to sit. Robert in his 50s, reading glasses perched on his nose, completely absorbed in a biography or historical novel while I watched television nearby. Robert in his 60s, newspapers spread across his lap as he kept up with world events and local politics, occasionally reading interesting passages aloud for my reaction. Robert in his final months, too weak to read for long periods, but still, claiming his place in that chair, finding comfort in its familiar embrace when his own body was failing him. The chair had been where he sat during his last Christmas with us, wrapped in the blue blanket I had knitted for him, watching his grandchildren open gifts with eyes that held both love and the knowledge that this might be his final holiday with them. It was where he dozed in the afternoons when the medication made him sleepy, where I would find him with a book fallen open across his chest, and his breathing slow and peaceful in a way that both comforted and frightened me. After Robert died, I couldn't bring myself to sit in that chair for months. It held too much of him, too much presence and absence combined. But gradually, I began to find solace there, especially in the evenings when the house felt too quiet and empty. I would curl up in the chair that still smelled faintly of his cologne and the old leather, wrapping myself in the same blue blanket, reading the books he had loved or simply sitting in the space that had been his, feeling closer to him than anywhere else in the house. Thomas had said they got a good price for it, as if that justified the theft of my husband's memory, as if the monetary value of old leather and wood could possibly compensate for the emotional devastation of losing this tangible connection to the man who had been my partner and best friend for nearly 5 decades. They had sold my grief, sold my comfort, sold the physical space where I went to feel less alone in a world that had already taken too much from me. The china cabinet had held our history in porcelain and crystal, each piece a marker of significant moments in our marriage and family life. The wedding china had been my mother's gift to us, her own grandmother's pattern that connected me to generations of women who had set tables and served meals and created homes where love could flourish. We had used those dishes for every anniversary dinner, every special occasion, every moment when we wanted to mark the importance of being together as a family. The crystal glasses had been Robert's parents' wedding gift, elegant stems that caught the light and made even ordinary water seem special. We had toasted the children's achievements with those glasses, celebrated promotions and birthdays, and all the small victories that make up a life well lived. Each piece had its story, its place in the narrative of our shared existence. And now, they were scattered to strangers who would never know or care about the love and celebration they had witnessed. The small porcelain figurines I had collected during our travels together were perhaps the most personal items that had been taken. Each one represented a memory, a place we had visited, a moment of joy shared between husband and wife exploring the world together. The little dancer from our trip to Vienna for our 20th anniversary, where we had walked through gardens and attended concerts and felt young again despite the gray in our hair. The small lighthouse from the Maine coast where we had spent a week one summer, reading books on the beach and eating lobster rolls while the children built sandcastles and chased seagulls. Every figurine had been chosen carefully, purchased not because of its monetary value, but because it captured something essential about that particular journey, that specific moment in our marriage when we were just Robert and Clara, not Mom, and Dad, not employees or homeowners or any of the other roles that defined our daily lives. They were tokens of our partnership, symbols of the adventures we had shared and the dreams we had pursued together. Now they were gone, disposed of by children who saw them as dust collectors rather than treasures, who had no understanding of the emotional weight carried by small objects, chosen with love and preserved with care. Susan probably kept a few pieces that appealed to her taste, discarding the rest without any consideration of what they had meant to the woman who had collected them over decades of marriage and travel and joy. The Persian rug had been another casualty of their systematic emptying of my home, though its loss felt different from the furniture and decorative items. That rug had been the foundation of our living room for 20 years, its intricate patterns and deep colors creating warmth and elegance that elevated the entire space. We had saved for months to afford it, visiting carpet dealers and learning about knots and patterns and the artistry that went into creating something so beautiful and enduring. Robert had been particular about where it was placed, adjusting and readjusting its position until it perfectly balanced the room's proportions and complemented the mahogany furniture. Over the years, it had absorbed the sounds of family life, cushioning footsteps and conversations, providing a soft place for grandchildren to play, and for our aging bodies to find comfort, when sitting on the floor became necessary for games or holiday morning gift opening. The rug had witnessed everything the furniture had witnessed, but from a different perspective, looking up at the life unfolding above it rather than supporting it directly. It had been stained by spilled wine and coffee, worn thin in the paths we walked most frequently, marked by the passage of time and the evidence of lives fully lived. Each imperfection had been earned through use and love, through the daily reality of a home where people actually lived rather than a showplace preserved for display. Now it was gone too, rolled up and carted away by children who saw only its market value, not its role as the foundation of family gatherings and quiet evenings, and all the ordinary moments that had made our house a home. They had literally pulled the rug out from under me, removing the physical foundation of the room where we had spent our most important family time together. Even the curtains had been taken, though their removal seemed almost vindictive rather than practical. The fabric had been expensive when we bought it 15 years ago, custom-made to fit the large windows in the living room and dining room. The patterns were classic, elegant, chosen to complement the furniture and create a sense of warmth and privacy that made our home feel separate from the outside world. Without the curtains, the windows looked naked and exposed, letting in harsh light that revealed every flaw in the walls and floors that had been softened and hidden by the gentle filtering of fabric. The house felt vulnerable without them, as if its privacy had been violated along with my trust. Anyone walking by could now see directly into the empty rooms, witnessing the evidence of what had been done to me. The removal of the curtains seemed particularly cruel because they served no real purpose for my children. They couldn't sell fabric window treatments that had been measured for my specific windows, and the patterns were too mature for their own homes and decorating tastes. Taking them served no practical purpose except to strip away another layer of my comfort and privacy, to make the violation of my home as complete as possible. As I sat in my kitchen through that long first night, drinking coffee and remembering everything that had been stolen from me, I began to understand that this wasn't really about furniture or money or even practical concerns about my ability to maintain my home. This was about power and control, about my children's decision that I was no longer capable of making my own choices about my own life and possessions. They had treated me like someone with dementia or severe mental incapacity, someone who couldn't be trusted to manage her own affairs or make reasonable decisions about her own belongings. But I was neither confused nor incompetent. I was grieving and lonely, certainly, but my mind was sharp and my judgment sound. I was perfectly capable of deciding what to keep and what to dispose of, what held meaning and what had become burden. The condescension in their voices when I had protested the theft of my belongings revealed how they truly saw me now. I was no longer their mother in any meaningful sense, no longer a person whose feelings and preferences mattered. I had become a problem to be managed, an obstacle to be overcome, a burden to be lightened through their intervention, whether I welcomed that intervention or not. David's insistence that we had discussed downsizing was particularly galling because it revealed the extent to which they were willing to gaslight me, to create false memories and fictional conversations to justify their actions. He spoke with such confidence about discussions that had never happened, plans I had never made, decisions I had never been part of, that for a moment I had actually doubted my own recollection of events. This manipulation felt almost worse than the theft itself because it attacked not just my possessions but my sanity, my ability to trust my own memory and perception of reality. If they were willing to lie so boldly about conversations that had never occurred, what else might they be lying about? What other aspects of my life might they be distorting or controlling without my knowledge or consent? Susan's dismissal of my emotional attachment to these items as excessive and inappropriate revealed a stunning lack of empathy and understanding. She seemed genuinely annoyed that I cared about objects that held deep personal significance, as if grief and sentiment were character flaws rather than natural human responses to loss and change. Her suggestion that I should be grateful for their intervention, that I should thank them for disposing of my memories and connections to my deceased husband, showed a callousness that I couldn't reconcile with the daughter I thought I had raised. Michael's justification that they were worried about me and trying to help me see that I didn't need such a big house was perhaps the most manipulative response of all. He presented their theft as concern, their violation of my home as assistance, their complete disregard for my feelings and preferences as evidence of their love and care for my well-being. This inversion of reality, where criminal behavior became kindness and violation became support, was so psychologically disturbing that it left me questioning everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my children. Thomas's honesty about the financial motivation was almost refreshing after his siblings' elaborate justifications and false concern. At least he acknowledged that they had acted for their own benefit rather than mine, that they had seen my possessions as assets, to be liquidated rather than memories to be preserved. His casual mention that the family had gotten some benefit from the sale revealed that he no longer considered me part of the family whose interests mattered, that I had been relegated to the role of resource to be exploited rather than person, to be respected. But perhaps most painful of all was the collective assumption underlying all of their responses, that I was already essentially dead, that my remaining years were merely a waiting period before they could claim what they considered rightfully theirs. They had spoken about my death not as a distant possibility, but as an imminent inevitability, something to be planned for and prepared for rather than grieved or feared. This casual acceptance of my mortality, combined with their complete disregard for my current life and feelings, revealed that they had already mentally buried me. I was a ghost in my own home, a temporary inconvenience standing between them and their inheritance, someone whose remaining time could be managed and controlled rather than honored and cherished. As dawn broke through the bare windows of my violated home, I felt something crystallizing inside me that was harder and sharper than anything I had experienced in my 73 years. My children had made a fundamental miscalculation about who I was and what I was capable of. They had assumed that age had made me weak, that grief had made me passive, that love for them would make me accept any treatment they chose to inflict upon me. They had confused my gentleness with weakness, my patience with passivity, my love with submission. They had forgotten that the woman who had raised 4 children, managed a household, supported a husband through career changes and health crises, and navigated decades of marriage and family life was not someone who could be easily dismissed or controlled. The furniture they had stolen had been more than possessions. It had been the physical manifestation of my identity as wife, mother, and keeper of family history. By removing these anchors of my life, they had attempted to erase not just my comfort, but my sense of self, my connection to the past that had shaped me and the future I was still writing. But they had overplayed their hand. In revealing their complete lack of respect for me as a person, they had freed me from the obligation to respect them as my children. In showing me that our relationship was based on their expectation of inheritance, rather than genuine love, they had liberated me from the need to preserve that inheritance for people who viewed me as an obstacle to their financial gain. The empty rooms around me were no longer evidence of what I had lost. They were proof of what I had learned. My children had taught me exactly who they were and what I meant to them. Now it was time for me to teach them exactly who I was and what they meant to me. The sun was fully up now, streaming through the bare windows and illuminating the ghost, images on the floor where my stolen memories had once lived. But instead of mourning what was gone, I found myself planning what would come next. My children thought they had taken control of my life and my future. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The house on Maple Street might be empty now, but it was still mine. And I was far from finished with the lessons I intended to teach about respect, assumption, and the dangerous mistake of underestimating a woman who had finally learned exactly where she stood with the people she had spent her life loving and serving. They had stolen my furniture, but they had also stolen my illusions about family and love and the bonds that connect parents and children. In return, I was about to give them an education in consequences that they would remember for the rest of their lives. The days following my discovery passed in a strange haze of hypervigilance and growing unease. I found myself checking the locks on my doors multiple times each day, something I had never felt compelled to do in 47 years of living in the same house. The violation of my home had shattered my sense of security in ways I was only beginning to understand. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by every small sound that might indicate someone was entering my house again, taking more of what little remained. My children began calling more frequently than they had in months, but these conversations felt different now, charged with an undercurrent of manipulation and false concern that I was only beginning to recognize. David called every other day, his voice artificially bright as he asked about my health and whether I needed help with anything around the house. The irony was not lost on me that he was offering assistance while simultaneously defending the theft of my belongings as necessary intervention for my own good. Susan stopped by twice during that first week, claiming she wanted to check on me and see how I was adjusting to what she continued to call my newly simplified living space. She walked through the empty rooms with a satisfied expression, commenting on how much more open and airy everything felt, as if the barren landscape of my former home was an improvement rather than a catastrophe. Her ability to stand in the ruins of my comfort and speak about it as progress was breathtaking in its cruelty. During these visits, I began to notice things I had overlooked before. Small signs that my children's disrespect and sense of entitlement extended far beyond the furniture theft. Susan would open my refrigerator without asking and comment on my food choices, suggesting that I was buying too much or the wrong kinds of groceries for someone my age. She rifled through my mail with casual familiarity, reading bills and statements, as if my financial privacy was no longer relevant. Most disturbing was the way she spoke about my house and possessions, using language that suggested ownership or at least shared custody of my property. She would say things like, "We should really get the gutters cleaned," or, "We need to have someone look at that loose board on the front steps," as if the house belonged to her as much as to me. The presumption was subtle but unmistakable, a gradual erosion of my autonomy disguised as family concern. David's visits followed a similar pattern, though his approach was more overtly controlling. He would arrive unannounced and immediately begin inspecting various aspects of the house, checking faucets for leaks, testing smoke detectors, examining windows for drafts. While these activities might have seemed helpful on the surface, they felt invasive and patronizing, as if I were incapable of maintaining my own living space or recognizing when repairs were needed. More troubling still was his habit of making decisions about my property without consulting me. During one visit, I returned from a brief trip to the grocery store to find him on the phone with a contractor, discussing estimates for replacing my perfectly functional furnace. When I questioned this, he explained that the current system was old and inefficient, that I would save money in the long run with a newer model, that he was just trying to help me make smart financial decisions. The patronizing tone in his voice was unmistakable, the same tone one might use with a child who didn't understand the complexities of adult responsibilities. He spoke as if my decades of home ownership and household management meant nothing, as if turning 73 had somehow erased my ability to make reasonable decisions about heating systems and energy efficiency. Michael's approach was more subtle, but perhaps more insidious. As the most financially successful of my children, he had appointed himself as my unofficial financial advisor, calling regularly to discuss my spending habits and investment decisions. These conversations always began with expressions of concern for my well-being and security, but quickly devolved into interrogations about my monthly expenses and suggestions for how I might reduce my financial burden. He spoke frequently about the costs of maintaining such a large house, the wisdom of downsizing to something more manageable, the benefits of moving to a retirement community where I wouldn't have to worry about home maintenance and upkeep. His arguments were logical and well presented, delivered with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to persuading clients and closing deals. But underneath the reasonable exterior, I could hear the impatience of someone waiting for me to reach the obvious conclusion that my current living situation was unsustainable. What made these conversations particularly galling was Michael's assumption that he understood my financial situation better than I did. He spoke about my expenses and assets as if he had access to detailed information about my accounts and investments, which raised uncomfortable questions about what other boundaries he might have crossed in his concern for my welfare. His confidence about my financial capabilities seemed to be based on more than general assumptions about elderly homeowners. Thomas was the most direct in his communication, though his honesty was often more brutal than his siblings' subtle manipulations. During a phone conversation in my second week of living in the stripped house, he told me bluntly that the family was worried I was becoming isolated and possibly depressed, that living alone in such a large house wasn't healthy for someone my age, that I needed to start thinking seriously about alternative living arrangements. When I pointed out that I had been living alone in the house for 2 years since Robert's death without any problems, Thomas dismissed this observation with impatience. He explained that my situation had changed, that I was getting older and more vulnerable, that the family couldn't continue to worry about my safety and well-being when I was being stubborn about making necessary changes to my living situation. The word stubborn hit me like a physical blow. My desire to remain in my own home, surrounded by whatever memories and comforts I had left, was characterized as stubbornness rather than preference. My attachment to the place where I had built My life and raised my family was presented as an unreasonable obstacle to their peace of mind, rather than a legitimate choice made by a competent adult. But it was during my third week in the empty house that I overheard a conversation that changed everything I thought I understood about my children's motivations and plans. Susan had stopped by for one of her increasingly frequent check-ins, and I had excused myself to use the bathroom while she took a phone call. As I returned down the hallway, I heard her voice through the thin walls, speaking in the low, urgent tones people use when discussing sensitive matters. "She's being more resistant than we expected," Susan was saying. "I thought after we cleared out some of the clutter, she'd start to see reason about downsizing, but she's still acting like this is all temporary. Michael thinks we need to be more direct about the financial realities of her situation." There was a pause as the person on the other end responded, and then Susan continued. "Well, David talked to that place in Sunny Gardens last week, and they have availability in their assisted living section. The monthly cost is actually less than what she's spending on utilities and maintenance here, and they handle everything for the residents. She'd probably be happier with people her own age around." My blood turned to ice as I realized they were discussing my future living arrangements without any input from me, making plans for my life as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than a person with rights and preferences. The casual way Susan spoke about moving me to assisted living, as if it were an inevitable conclusion rather than a drastic change that would require my consent, revealed the extent to which they had already decided my fate. "The thing is," Susan continued, "we can't let her keep burning through money maintaining this house when she's going to need those resources for care as she gets older." Thomas ran the numbers, and between property taxes, utilities, insurance, and upkeep, she's spending almost $3,000 a month just to live here. That's money that should be preserved for her medical needs down the road. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Susan discussing various strategies for convincing me to sell the house and move to a facility where my care could be managed more efficiently. She spoke about my resistance to change as a phase that would pass once I adjusted to the reality of my situation, about the importance of family unity in making difficult decisions, about the need to act in my best interests, even when I couldn't see those interests clearly myself. When the call ended and Susan rejoined me in the kitchen, her demeanor was warm and concerned, asking about my comfort and whether I needed anything from the store. The contrast between her public face and the private conversation I had just overheard was so stark that I felt dizzy with the realization of how thoroughly I was being deceived and manipulated. That evening, after Susan left, I sat in my empty living room and tried to process what I had learned. My children weren't just concerned about my well-being or worried about my ability to maintain my independence. They were actively planning to remove me from my home and place me in institutional care, not because I needed such care, but because it would be more convenient for them and more financially advantageous in the long term. The reference to preserving resources for my future medical needs was particularly cynical, since any money saved by forcing me into assisted living would ultimately become part of their inheritance. They were justifying the destruction of my current quality of life by claiming it would benefit my future care, when the real beneficiaries would be themselves when I died and left them whatever assets remained. Over the following days, I began to pay closer attention to my children's behavior and conversations, listening for clues about the extent of their planning and coordination. What I discovered was even more disturbing than I had imagined. They had clearly been discussing my situation for months, possibly since Robert's death, treating my grief and adjustment to widowhood as signs of incompetence rather than normal responses to major life changes. David's casual references to contractors and repair estimates took on new meaning when I realized he was probably gathering information to support arguments about the financial burden of homeownership. Michael's detailed knowledge of my expenses suggested he had been tracking my spending patterns, possibly through access to financial information I had never knowingly shared. Susan's increasing presence in my home and her proprietary attitude toward my possessions indicated that she was already thinking of herself as my guardian or caretaker rather than my daughter. Most chilling was the discovery that they had been researching care facilities and gathering information about costs, availability, and admission requirements. This wasn't casual concern about my future needs. This was active planning for a transition they had already decided was necessary and inevitable. The realization that my children had been secretly planning my future while maintaining the pretense of normal family relationships was devastating in ways that went beyond the furniture theft. They had been lying to me for months, possibly years, about their true intentions and motivations. Every expression of love and concern had been tainted by their hidden agenda to remove me from my home and control my remaining years. But perhaps most painful was the understanding that they saw me not as their mother, but as a burden and an inconvenience. Someone whose preferences and feelings were obstacles to be overcome rather than considerations to be respected. They had reduced me to a problem requiring a solution, and that solution involved removing me from everything familiar and placing me in an environment where my care could be managed by strangers while they got on with their lives unencumbered by concern for my daily welfare. The conversation I had overheard also revealed something else that was deeply troubling. They were discussing my finances with a level of detail that suggested access to information they shouldn't have had. Michael's references to specific costs and Thomas's analysis of my monthly expenses indicated that someone had been monitoring my financial activities without my knowledge or permission. This violation of my privacy felt almost as invasive as the theft of my furniture, and raised serious questions about what other boundaries they might have crossed in their efforts to manage my life. Did they have access to my bank accounts? Were they monitoring my credit card statements? Had they somehow gained access to my financial records through legitimate means? Or had they violated my privacy in more serious ways? The thought that my own children might be spying on my financial activities, tracking my spending, and using this information to build a case for my incompetence was both frightening and infuriating. It suggested a level of calculation and manipulation that I had never imagined they were capable of, a willingness to violate my most basic rights to privacy and autonomy in service of their own convenience and financial interests. As I sat in my empty house that night, surrounded by the echoing spaces where my life used to live, I began to understand that I was facing something much more serious than family disagreement or generational conflict. I was dealing with adult children who had decided that my rights as an independent person were secondary to their desire to control my remaining years and preserve their eventual inheritance. They had taken my furniture without permission, invaded my privacy, planned my future without my input, and lied to me consistently about their motivations and activities. They had treated me not as their mother, but as their ward, someone whose autonomy could be gradually eroded through a combination of manipulation, false concern, and systematic removal of the supports that allowed me to maintain my independence. But their most serious miscalculation was assuming that I would passively accept this treatment, that I would gradually surrender my rights and preferences in response to their pressure and manipulation. They had confused my love for them with weakness, my grief with incompetence, my age with helplessness. They were about to learn just how wrong they were about all of those things. The next morning, I called my lawyer, someone I hadn't spoken to since Robert's death, but who had handled our wills and estate planning for decades. James Morrison was 70 himself, old enough to understand the particular vulnerabilities that come with age, but young enough to still practice law with the sharp precision that had made him successful throughout his career. When I explained what had been happening, James was silent for a long moment before responding with controlled anger that matched my own. He informed me that what my children had done constituted theft, regardless of their relationship to me, or their claims about my well-being. He also explained that their apparent access to my financial information without explicit permission could constitute identity theft or financial abuse, depending on how they had obtained this access. More importantly, James assured me that their plans to move me to assisted living could not be implemented without my consent unless they could prove legal incompetence through court proceedings, a process that would require medical evidence and legal representation that they clearly hadn't pursued. Their assumption that they could simply convince or pressure me into accepting their plans revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both my legal rights and my mental capabilities. During that conversation, James asked me a question that would change the entire trajectory of my response to my children's betrayal. Clara, what do you want to happen here? Do you want to preserve your relationship with your children and find a way to work through this? Or do you want to send a message that you're not someone who can be manipulated and controlled? I didn't hesitate in my response. I want to send a message, James. A very clear message that they will never forget. What happened next would be the most decisive action I had taken in my entire life, a choice that would forever alter my relationship with my children and demonstrate that a 73-year-old woman was far from helpless when properly motivated. But first, I needed to make some preparations to ensure that when I acted, the impact would be as dramatic and unmistakable as the lesson I intended to teach. My children thought they understood who I was and what I was capable of. They were about to discover that they had never really known their mother at all. James Morrison's office felt like a sanctuary the next afternoon, when I sat across from his mahogany desk, surrounded by law books and the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades protecting people's rights and interests. The familiar smell of leather and old paper reminded me of Robert's study, and for a moment I felt steadied by the connection to a time when my life made sense and my place in it was secure. Clara, James said, his weathered hands folded on the desk between us. Before we discuss your options, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Have you noticed any changes in your memory or cognitive function? Any confusion about dates, places, or people? Any difficulty managing your daily affairs or financial responsibilities? The questions stung, even though I understood why he needed to ask them. If my children were questioning my competence, any legal action I took would need to be bulletproof against claims that I wasn't thinking clearly or acting in my own best interests. I answered each question honestly, detailing my routines, my financial management, my clear recollection of recent events and conversations. James took notes as I spoke, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details about my daily life and mental state. After nearly an hour of questioning, he leaned back in his chair and smiled for the first time since I had arrived. Clara, you are one of the most cognitively sharp people I've encountered at any age. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is sound, and your understanding of your situation is both accurate and sophisticated. If your children believe they can have you declared incompetent, they are in for a very unpleasant surprise. Now, opened a thick folder and began pulling out documents, explaining the various legal protections available to me and the options I had for responding to my children's behavior. But it was his next suggestion that stopped me cold and changed the entire direction of my thinking. Given what you've told me about their apparent sense of entitlement to your property and their assumption that they will inherit the house, there is one action you could take that would send an unmistakable message about your competence and your authority over your own life. You could sell the house. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge and an opportunity. Sell the house. The house where I had lived for 47 years, where I had raised my children, where Robert and I had built our life together. The house my children considered their birthright, their guaranteed inheritance, their reward for enduring the inconvenience of my continued existence. If you sold the house, James continued, it would accomplish several things simultaneously. It would prove beyond question that you are mentally competent and capable of making major financial decisions. It would demonstrate that you, not your children, control your assets and your future. And it would force them to confront the reality that inheritance is a gift, not a right, something that can be revoked if the relationship between parent and child breaks down. I sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what he was suggesting. Selling the house would be more than a legal or financial decision. It would be a complete upheaval of my life and a definitive break from the past that had shaped my identity for nearly 5 decades. But it would also be the most powerful statement I could make about my autonomy and my refusal to be treated as an object rather than a person. "What would happen to the money from the sale?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That would be entirely up to you," James replied. "You could buy a smaller home more suited to your current needs. You could move to a retirement community of your choice, not one selected by your children. You could travel if that interests you. You could donate it to charity. You could spend it on whatever brings you joy and comfort. The point is that it would be your choice, made by you for your own reasons." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time since Robert's death, I was contemplating a future that I would create entirely on my own terms, without reference to what my children expected or wanted or thought was best for me. The possibility of complete independence, of starting over at 73, was daunting but also oddly liberating. "How long would it take?" I asked. "In this market, probably 6 to 8 weeks from listing to closing, assuming we price it appropriately. I can recommend a real estate agent who specializes in quick sales for clients who need to move quickly for personal reasons. She's discreet, professional, and very effective." James gave me the name and contact information for Sarah Chen, a realtor who had handled several similar situations for his clients. He also provided me with a list of financial advisors who could help me manage the proceeds from the sale and plan for my future housing needs. But perhaps most importantly, he assured me that everything we did could be kept completely confidential until I chose to reveal my plans. "The key to making this work," he explained, "is to complete the entire process without your children's knowledge. If they learn what you're doing before the sale is final, they may try to interfere or challenge your capacity to make such a decision. But once the house is sold and the money is in your control, their options for intervention become extremely limited." I left James's office with a briefcase full of documents and a plan that felt both impossible and inevitable. The drive home, through familiar neighborhoods, took on a different quality, as if I were seeing everything through the eyes of someone who might soon be saying goodbye to a life she had lived for nearly half a century. That evening, I called Sarah Chen and arranged to meet her the following morning. She arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, a compact woman in her 50s with short silver hair and eyes that missed nothing as she walked through my house. Despite the emptiness of the main rooms, she seemed to understand immediately what the house had been and what it could be again for the right buyer. "This is a beautiful property," she said, as we concluded the tour in the kitchen. "Classic colonial architecture, excellent bones, mature landscaping, desirable neighborhood. Even empty, it has wonderful character and potential. I think we can move this quickly if you're serious about selling." I told her I was very serious, and we spent the next 2 hours discussing pricing strategy, marketing plans, and timeline. Sarah explained that she would need to bring in a photographer and a staging consultant to prepare the house for showing, but that she could have it listed within a week if I was ready to proceed. "Mrs. Hughes," she said as she prepared to leave, "I handle a lot of sales for clients who are making major life transitions, often under difficult family circumstances. If you need this to remain confidential until the sale is complete, I can guarantee that discretion. My team signs confidentiality agreements, and we don't discuss our clients' business with anyone who isn't directly involved in the transaction." Her understanding and professionalism gave me confidence that I could trust her with the most important decision I had made in decades. We agreed that she would return the following week with her team to begin preparing the house for market, and that we would aim for a listing date 10 days later. Over the next week, I began the emotional process of deciding what to do with my remaining possessions and preparing myself for the reality of leaving the home where I had spent most of my adult life. The task felt overwhelming at first, but gradually I began to see it as an opportunity to carefully choose what parts of my past I wanted to carry into my future. I started with Robert's belongings, the the clothes and personal items I hadn't been able to bring myself to sort through in the 2 years since his death. Opening his closet and touching his shirts and jackets brought waves of grief, but also a strange sense of completion. I kept a few items that held special meaning: his wedding ring and watch, his favorite sweater that still smelled faintly of his cologne, the leather wallet he had carried for 20 years. The rest I donated to a veterans organization, knowing he would have approved of helping other men who had served their country. The photographs scattered throughout the house required more careful consideration. I spent hours sitting on the floor of my empty living room, sorting through decades of family pictures, keeping the ones that brought joy and discarding those that now felt tainted by recent revelations about my children's true feelings toward me. Many of the images from holidays and celebrations that I had treasured just weeks before now looked different to my eyes, colored by the knowledge of what my children had been thinking and planning even as they smiled for the camera. But I kept the pictures from earlier years, when the children were young and our family seemed genuine in its love and connection. Those memories belonged to me regardless of what had happened since, and I refused to let my children's current behavior steal the joy I had taken in their childhood and in my role as their mother during those years. I also kept the photographs of Robert and me together, especially those from our travels and quiet moments when it was just the two of us. These images reminded me of who I had been before I became solely defined by my role as mother and grandmother. When I had been Clara the individual, the woman Robert had fallen in love with and chosen to share his life with. The books throughout the house posed another challenge. Robert and I had been voracious readers, and our shelves held hundreds of volumes accumulated over decades of shared interests and individual pursuits. I kept the ones that had been gifts from Robert, the volumes of poetry he had given me for anniversaries and birthdays, the travel guides from trips we had taken together, the novels we had discussed over evening coffee. But I also chose books based on my future rather than my past, volumes about starting over, about women who had reinvented themselves later in life, about the courage required to leave familiar comfort for unknown possibility. These books would be my companions in whatever new life I was about to create, reminders that 73 was not too old for adventure and change. The jewelry sorting was perhaps the most emotionally charged task of all. My wedding rings, which I had continued to wear every day since Robert's death, felt heavy on my finger as I considered their significance in my new reality. These rings had symbolized a partnership that had lasted 49 years, a commitment that had ended only with death, a love that had been the foundation of everything I had built since. But they also represented a chapter of my life that was complete, a role that could never be repeated or replaced. After much consideration, I decided to keep them but to stop wearing them daily. They would be treasures to remember Robert by, not symbols of an identity that no longer fully defined who I was becoming. I kept the pieces Robert had given me over the years: the necklace for our 25th anniversary, the earrings he had surprised me with for my 50th birthday, the bracelet that had been his final gift to me before his illness made shopping impossible. These items connected me to the best parts of my past while serving as reminders that I had been loved deeply and completely by a good man who had seen value in me that went far beyond my usefulness to others. During this week of sorting and preparation, my children continued their pattern of frequent contact and unwelcome involvement in my daily life. But now I saw their behavior through the lens of my new understanding and my secret plans, and every interaction reinforced my conviction that selling the house was not just justified, but necessary for my survival as an independent person. David stopped by twice to check on various aspects of the house's maintenance, but I noticed he was taking more detailed notes than usual and asking specific questions about the age and condition of major systems. When I asked why he needed such detailed information, he explained that he was trying to help me understand the full costs of homeownership so I could make informed decisions about my future. His explanation was reasonable on the surface, but I now understood that he was probably gathering information to support arguments about the financial burden of keeping the house. Every issue he identified, every potential repair he mentioned, was ammunition for the campaign to convince me that remaining in my home was financially irresponsible and practically impossible. Susan's visits became even more intrusive during this period. She began taking photographs of various rooms, claiming she wanted to document the house's condition in case I ever decided to make changes or updates. But I suspected she was creating a visual record to support their narrative about my declining ability to maintain the property and the need for intervention on my behalf. Most disturbingly, she began removing additional items from the house, small things she claimed I no longer needed or that would be safer in her care. Kitchen gadgets I rarely used, books she thought I had finished reading, decorative items that she suggested were just collecting dust. Each removal was presented as helpfulness, but the cumulative effect was to further strip my home of personality and comfort. Michael's financial interrogations became more intense and specific during this period. He wanted to know exact figures for my monthly expenses, detailed information about my investment accounts, and projections for my future financial needs. He presented these requests as necessary for helping me plan for a secure retirement, but I could see the calculation behind his concern. He was building a case for my financial vulnerability, documenting my expenses and assets to support arguments about the need for professional money management and controlled living arrangements. Every dollar I spent on house maintenance, every utility bill, every expense related to independent living was being tallied as evidence that my current lifestyle was unsustainable. Thomas was the most direct in his pressure during this week, calling almost daily to discuss his research into retirement communities and assisted living facilities. He had gathered brochures and pricing information from several local facilities, and he wanted to schedule tours so I could see what kinds of options were available to someone in my situation. His enthusiasm for these facilities was coupled with increasingly dire predictions about the risks of living alone at my age. Every news story about elderly people who had fallen or become ill without immediate assistance was shared with me as evidence that independent living was dangerous and irresponsible. He spoke about my current situation as if I were already living on borrowed time, as if every day I remained in my own home was a gamble with my safety and well-being. But perhaps most revealing was a conversation I overheard between David and Susan when they didn't realize I was within earshot. They were discussing timeline and strategy, debating whether to present me with a united front about the need to sell the house, or to continue their individual approaches until I reached the conclusion they wanted me to reach. "She's more stubborn than we expected," David was saying. "I thought after we cleared out some of the furniture she'd start to see that the house is too much for her, but she's still acting like everything is normal. Michael thinks we need to be more direct about the money," Susan replied. "If she understood how much she's spending just to keep this place running, she'd realize it's not sustainable. Maybe we should sit her down together and go through the numbers." "The problem is that she's not thinking rationally about this," David continued. "She's too emotionally attached to the house to see the practical realities. We may need to be more forceful about what's best for her, even if she doesn't like it at first." Listening to them discuss strategies for overcoming my resistance to their plans, as if my preferences and feelings were obstacles to be managed rather than factors to be respected, confirmed everything I had suspected about their motivations and methods. They saw me as a problem to be solved, not a person to be honored, and they were prepared to use whatever manipulation and pressure necessary to achieve their goals. But what they didn't understand was that their campaign to convince me I was incapable of living independently was actually strengthening my resolve to prove them wrong in the most dramatic way possible. Every attempt to diminish my autonomy made me more determined to demonstrate my competence. Every effort to control my choices made me more committed to making a choice that would shock them into recognizing that I was still very much in control of my own life. The photographer and staging consultant arrived on schedule the following Monday, transforming my empty house into a showcase of architectural possibility. Professional lighting and carefully placed rental furniture made each room look spacious and elegant, while strategic decorating created warmth and character that buyers could envision as their own. Standing in my living room after the staging was complete, I barely recognized the space where I had spent thousands of hours over nearly 5 decades. The room looked beautiful and sophisticated, but it no longer felt like mine. It had become a product to be sold, a commodity in the real estate market rather than the heart of a home where a family had lived and loved and grown together. The transformation was both painful and liberating. Painful because it represented the final severing of my connection to the life I had built with Robert and the children. Liberating because it proved that I was capable of letting go, of choosing change over comfort, of prioritizing my future over my past. Sarah Chen arrived that afternoon to review the staging and finalize the listing details. As we walked through the house together, she pointed out the features that would appeal most to potential buyers and the selling points that would help us achieve our target price and timeline. "This house will sell quickly," she predicted confidently. "The location is excellent, the condition is good despite the age, and the staging really highlights the architectural details and natural light. I think we'll have multiple offers within the first week." The listing went live at midnight on Wednesday, and Sarah called me at 8 in the morning to report that 3 potential buyers had already requested showings. By the end of the first day, we had scheduled 6 appointments for the weekend and 2 more for the following week. I spent that first day of active marketing in a state of nervous excitement, alternating between anxiety about what I was doing and exhilaration about the possibility of succeeding beyond my children's worst fears. The knowledge that strangers were looking at photographs of my house online, making calculations about its value and desirability, felt surreal and slightly overwhelming, but it also felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in months, I was the one making decisions about my life and my future. I was the one taking action instead of responding to other people's plans and manipulations. I was the one holding the cards that would determine what happened next. My children continued their usual pattern of calls and visits during this period, completely unaware that their inheritance was being photographed, marketed, and shown to potential buyers who saw it not as their birthright, but as their future home. The irony of their continued pressure for me to sell the house, even as I was secretly doing exactly that, was not lost on me. The first weekend of showings was both exhausting and encouraging. Sarah arranged for me to stay at a nearby hotel during the peak showing hours, allowing potential buyers to walk through the house without the awkwardness of the current owner being present. But I could see the activity from my hotel room window, the steady stream of cars pulling into my driveway, the families and couples walking up my front steps with hope and possibility in their expressions. By Sunday evening, we had received 2 offers, both above our asking price and both with flexible closing timelines that would allow me to plan my next move without pressure. Sarah recommended accepting the higher offer, which came from a young family with children who reminded me of my own family 40 years earlier when we had first walked through the house and imagined our future within its walls. Standing in my kitchen that Sunday night, looking at the purchase agreement that would transfer ownership of my home to strangers within 6 weeks, I felt a mixture of grief and anticipation that was unlike anything I had experienced before. I was saying goodbye to nearly half a century of memories, but I was also saying hello to a future that I would create entirely on my own terms. The next morning, I called James Morrison to review the purchase agreement and confirm that all the legal protections we had discussed were in place. He assured me that the contract was solid and that the buyers appeared to be financially qualified and genuinely committed to the purchase. "Clara," he said as we concluded our conversation, "I want you to know that what you're doing takes tremendous courage. Not many people your age would be willing to make such a dramatic change, especially under these circumstances. I admire your strength and your determination to control your own destiny." His words meant more to me than he could have known. Validation that my decision was not the act of a confused or incompetent elderly woman, but the choice of someone who refused to accept diminished autonomy and respect. I was not running away from my children or my responsibilities. I was running toward a future where I would be valued and honored as the person I still was, rather than tolerated as the burden I had apparently become. The house would be sold. The money would be mine to control and spend as I chose, and my children would learn that their mother was far from finished with the business of living her own life on her own terms. The lesson I was about to teach them would be unforgettable, and the woman they thought they could manipulate and control was about to show them exactly how much they had underestimated her strength and determination. The revolution had begun, quiet and methodical and unstoppable, and by the time they realized what was happening, it would be far too late to prevent the consequences of their own arrogance and presumption. The morning of the closing arrived with an unusual clarity of purpose that I hadn't felt in months. I woke before dawn in the hotel room where I had been staying for the past week, watching the sun rise over a horizon that would soon frame a completely different life. Today, the house on Maple Street would officially belong to the Chen family, and I would become a woman without a permanent address for the first time since my marriage to Robert 50 years ago. The papers had been signed, the inspections completed, the financing approved. Sarah had handled every detail with the discretion and efficiency she had promised, ensuring that the transaction remained invisible to anyone who wasn't directly involved. My children continued their daily calls and weekly visits, completely unaware that their assumed inheritance was being transferred to strangers who saw it as a beginning rather than an ending. But there was one final detail that needed to be addressed before the sale became public knowledge. The revelation itself required careful planning, timing that would maximize the impact and minimize their ability to interfere or rationalize what had happened. I had spent weeks considering how and when to tell them, and I had concluded that the most effective approach would be the most direct one. I called David first, my hands surprisingly steady as I dialed his number at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning. He answered on the second ring, his voice cheerful and unsuspecting as he launched into his usual inquiries about my health and daily activities. "Good morning, Mom. How are you feeling today? I was thinking I might stop by this afternoon to check on that loose railing on the back steps. I've been meaning to get that fixed for you." "David," I interrupted, my voice calm and clear, "I'm calling to let you know that I sold the house. The closing is this morning, and the new owners will be taking possession next week." The silence that followed lasted so long that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When David finally spoke, his voice was completely different, stripped of its casual warmth and replaced by something sharp and disbelieving. "What do you mean you sold the house? That's impossible. You can't sell the house without discussing it with us first. There are legal procedures, family considerations, financial implications you don't understand." His immediate assumption that I lacked the authority or competence to make decisions about my own property confirmed everything I had suspected about his attitude toward my autonomy. He wasn't asking why I had made this choice or expressing concern for my well-being. He was challenging my right to act independently and demanding explanations for behavior he considered beyond my capabilities. "I mean exactly what I said, David. I listed the house 3 weeks ago, accepted an offer from a lovely young family, and completed all the necessary legal and financial procedures. The sale is final, and I am no longer the owner of the property. You and your siblings considered your inheritance." "This is insane," David said, his voice rising with anger and panic. "You can't do this. You're not thinking clearly. This is exactly the kind of erratic behavior we've been worried about. We need to stop this before it's too late." "It's already too late," I replied calmly. "The papers are signed, the money is in my account, and the deed has been transferred. There's nothing to stop because everything has already been completed." David began speaking rapidly about legal challenges, claims of incompetence, the possibility of having the sale reversed, on grounds of diminished capacity. But his threats rang hollow because we both knew that 3 weeks of successful negotiation with realtors, lawyers, bankers, and inspectors had created a documented trail of my complete mental competence and careful decision-making. "Why would you do this to us?" he finally asked, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine anguish. "This house was supposed to be our inheritance. It was supposed to stay in the family. You've destroyed everything we were counting on for our own family's security." The question revealed the depth of his sense of entitlement and the extent to which he had confused his wants with his rights. He spoke as if I had stolen something that belonged to him rather than disposed of my own property according to my own wishes. The pain in his voice was real, but it was the pain of thwarted expectation rather than genuine concern for my welfare. "David," I said, "inheritance is a gift, not a guarantee. It's something parents choose to give their children based on the quality of the relationship and the respect shown over the years. You and your siblings made it very clear that you view me as an obstacle to your inheritance rather than the person who created it. You treated my home like it was already yours and my possessions like they were yours to dispose of. You made plans for my future without consulting me and spoke about my death as if it were a business opportunity rather than the loss of someone you love." I could hear him crying now, but his tears didn't move me the way they might have just weeks earlier. These were not the tears of a son who had realized he had hurt his mother. These were the tears of someone who had been caught in his selfishness and was facing consequences he had never imagined possible. "We were trying to help you," he said. "We were worried about you living alone in such a big house. We thought, if we made some changes gradually, you'd start to see that downsizing made sense. We never meant to hurt you." "You sold my furniture without permission," I reminded him. "You entered my home while I was away and removed items that held precious memories of my life with your father. You spoke about me as if I were already dead and my possessions were already yours to distribute. You made plans to move me to assisted, living without asking what I wanted or needed. That's not helping, David. That's controlling and manipulating someone you consider too weak and stupid to make her own decisions." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with David alternating between anger, disbelief, and desperate attempts to find some way to undo what had been done. But eventually, he seemed to understand that no amount of arguing or pleading would change the reality of the situation. The house was sold, the money was mine, and the inheritance he had considered guaranteed was gone. I called Susan next, and her reaction was even more explosive than David's had been. She immediately began screaming about legal action, family, betrayal, and my obvious mental incompetence. According to Susan, no rational person my age would make such a drastic decision without consulting her family, and the fact that I had done so proved that I needed immediate intervention and protection from my own poor judgment. "This is elder abuse," she shouted into the phone. "Someone has manipulated you into this decision. No one sells their house in secret unless they're being coerced or exploited. We're going to find out who's behind this and have them prosecuted." Her assumption that I couldn't possibly have made this decision independently revealed how completely she had dismissed my intelligence and autonomy. In her mind, any choice I made that conflicted with her expectations had to be the result of outside manipulation, rather than my own careful consideration of my options and priorities. When I explained that I had acted entirely on my own, with the advice of professionals I had selected and trusted, Susan became even more agitated. She demanded the names of my lawyer and realtor, threatening to have them investigated for taking advantage of an elderly client. She insisted that the sale could be reversed if she could prove that I had been pressured or deceived into signing documents I didn't understand. "Susan," I said when she finally paused for breath, "I am 73 years old, not 93. I have been managing financial and legal affairs for over 50 years. I understand exactly what I have done and why I have done it. The professionals who helped me treated me with respect and ensured that I understood every aspect of the transaction. No one manipulated or coerced me into anything." "Then why?" she demanded. "Why would you destroy our family's legacy? Why would you throw away everything Dad worked for? Why would you hurt us like this when all we ever did was try to take care of you?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with assumptions and accusations that revealed how little she understood about what had actually been happening in our family relationships. Susan genuinely seemed to believe that selling my house was an act of cruelty toward her, rather than a response to the cruelty she and her brothers had shown toward me. "You took care of me by stealing my furniture?" I asked. "You took care of me by planning to move me to assisted living without my consent? You took care of me by treating my home like it was already yours, and my feelings like they didn't matter? You took care of me by speaking about my death as if it were a solution to your problems rather than a loss you would grieve?" Susan's response revealed the depth of her self-deception about her motivations and behavior. She insisted that everything they had done was motivated by love and concern, that removing my furniture had been intended to help me adjust to a more manageable living situation, that researching care facilities was responsible planning for my future needs. According to Susan, I was being ungrateful and unreasonable in my interpretation of their actions. They had sacrificed their time and energy to help me navigate the challenges of aging and widowhood, and my decision to sell the house was a betrayal of their devotion and a rejection of their love. The conversation with Michael was more controlled, but perhaps more chilling than the others. As the most financially sophisticated of my children, he immediately began calculating the monetary loss and exploring legal remedies for what he saw as a catastrophic family financial disaster. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked, his voice cold and precise. "That house was worth $800,000. That was our children's college funds, our retirement security, the foundation of our family's financial stability. You've literally stolen our future from us." His characterization of my decision as theft was particularly offensive, given that he was talking about my property, purchased with my money and my husband's money, maintained with our labor and resources. For nearly half a century, the idea that I had stolen something by disposing of my own assets according to my own wishes revealed a sense of entitlement so complete that it bordered on delusional. "Michael," I said, "that house belonged to me, not to you. The money from its sale belongs to me, not to you. Your financial planning should have been based on your own resources and efforts, not on assumptions about what you would inherit from parents who are still alive and capable of making their own decisions." He began lecturing me about family, financial planning, intergenerational wealth transfer, and the importance of preserving assets for future generations. According to Michael, responsible parents consider their children's financial needs when making decisions about their estates, and my failure to consult with him about the sale demonstrated either incompetence or selfishness. "What are you going to do with the money?" he demanded. "Where are you going to live? How are you going to manage your care as you get older? Have you thought about any of these practical considerations, or did you just act impulsively out of spite?" His questions revealed his assumption that I couldn't possibly have planned for my future without his guidance and oversight. The idea that I might have already made arrangements for my next phase of life, that I might have considered my options carefully and chosen a path that would give me independence and dignity, seemed beyond his imagination. "I've purchased a lovely condominium in a community designed for active adults," I told him. "It's smaller than the house but perfectly suited to my current needs, with maintenance-free living and access to social activities and cultural events. I'll be moving next month and I'm looking forward to the change." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Michael had clearly expected to find me helpless and confused, someone who had acted impulsively without considering the consequences. The discovery that I had not only sold the house, but already arranged alternative housing that suited my preferences and lifestyle was apparently more shocking than the sale itself. Thomas was the last of my children I called, and his reaction was perhaps the most honest. After I explained what I had done, he was quiet for a long moment before responding with what sounded like grudging admiration. "Well," he said finally, "I have to admit I didn't see this coming. You really caught us all off guard with this one. Mom, I'm not happy about it, but I have to respect the planning and execution. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. His acknowledgement that I had acted with intelligence and forethought was the closest any of my children had come to recognizing my competence and autonomy. But even Thomas couldn't resist expressing his disappointment about the financial impact of my decision on his own family's future. I just wish you had talked to us first, he said. Maybe we could have worked something out that would have addressed your concerns while still keeping the house in the family. This feels like such a waste of everything Dad built and worked for. Thomas, I replied, your father built a life with me, not for you. He worked to provide for his family while he was alive, not to guarantee your comfort after he was gone. The house was the place where we raised you and loved you and gave you the foundation to build your own lives. That gift was given during your childhood and young adulthood. You were never entitled to receive it again as adults. It was during this conversation that Thomas asked the question that would lead to the most important revelation of all. The truth that would put everything that had happened into a different and more complex perspective. Mom, he said, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you having any memory problems? Any confusion or difficulty keeping track of things? Because some of the things you've been doing and saying lately don't seem like the mom we've always known. The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of the genuine concern in his voice. For the first time in our conversation, Thomas sounded like he was asking out of love rather than anger or disappointment. It was the first indication that there might be more to my children's behavior than simple greed and control. Why do you ask that, Thomas? I said carefully. Because 6 months ago, you called me 3 times in one day asking about Dad's funeral arrangements, like you couldn't remember that we had already buried him 2 years ago. You've forgotten conversations we've had, repeated yourself during phone calls, seemed confused about dates and appointments. We've all noticed it, Mom. That's part of why we've been so worried about you living alone. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were false, but because they were true. I had been having some memory issues, small lapses that I had attributed to grief and stress, but that had apparently been more noticeable to my children than I had realized. The possibility that their concerns about my competence had been based on genuine observations rather than imagined problems changed everything about how I understood their recent behavior. And when we found you standing in your nightgown in the front yard at 2 a.m. last month, completely confused about where you were and why you were outside, that scared us, Mom. That's not normal forgetfulness. That's something more serious. I had no memory of this incident, which was perhaps the most frightening revelation of all. The idea that I had episodes of confusion that I couldn't recall, that my children had witnessed behavior that genuinely justified their concerns about my safety and judgment, forced me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about the situation. We talked to Dr. Patterson about it, Thomas continued, and he said that early-stage dementia can include periods of clarity mixed with episodes of confusion. He said it was possible that you might not even remember the times when you're having problems, which would explain why you don't think anything is wrong. The conversation continued for another hour, with Thomas gently describing incidents and behaviors that painted a picture of cognitive decline that I couldn't dispute, because I had no memory of the events he was describing. According to him, there had been dozens of small signs over the past year. Forgotten appointments, repeated conversations, confusion about familiar places and people, episodes of disorientation that had frightened my children and motivated their increased involvement in my life. That's why we moved some of your furniture, Thomas explained. Dr. Patterson said that reducing clutter and simplifying your environment might help with the confusion and disorientation. We weren't trying to steal from you or hurt you. We were trying to make your home safer and less overwhelming. And the assisted living research? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the answer. We wanted to have options available when the time came that living alone wasn't safe anymore. We weren't planning to force you into anything immediately, but we knew that day might come, sooner than any of us wanted to admit. As Thomas spoke, I began to have flashes of memory, fragments of conversations and incidents that I had apparently forgotten or dismissed. The phone calls where I had repeated myself, the times I had seemed confused about familiar routines, the morning I had awakened in my garden with no memory of how I had gotten there. The realization that my children's recent behavior might have been motivated by genuine love and concern rather than greed and manipulation was overwhelming. If I was indeed in the early stages of dementia, then their attempts to simplify my environment and plan for my future care were acts of responsibility, rather than control. But even as I absorbed this new understanding of their motivations, I couldn't ignore the fact that they had made decisions about my life without including me in the process. Even if their concerns were legitimate, their methods had been paternalistic and disrespectful of my autonomy and dignity. "Thomas," I said finally, "if you were worried about my memory and judgment, why didn't you talk to me directly about it? Why didn't you involve me in decisions about my own care and living situation?" "We tried, Mom, but you didn't seem to understand what we were telling you, or you'd forget the conversations a few days later." It was like trying to plan with someone who couldn't retain the information long enough to make informed decisions. The conversation ended with more questions than answers, but with a recognition that the situation was more complex than any of us had initially understood. My children's behavior had been motivated by a combination of legitimate concern and financial self-interest. My own perceptions had been affected by cognitive changes that I was only beginning to acknowledge and understand. Over the following weeks, as I settled into my new condominium and began the process of rebuilding my relationship with my children, we all had to confront difficult truths about aging, autonomy, family responsibility, and the challenge of balancing safety with independence. My children had to learn that even if their mother was developing dementia, she was still a person deserving of respect and inclusion in decisions about her own life. They had to understand that love and concern don't justify deception and manipulation, even when the person being protected might not fully understand the dangers they face. I had to learn that my fierce independence and pride had prevented me from recognizing and addressing real problems that were affecting my safety and judgment. I had to accept that needing help doesn't mean losing all control, and that accepting support from my children doesn't have to mean surrendering my dignity and autonomy. Most importantly, we all had to learn that family relationships require constant renegotiation as circumstances change, that the roles of parent and child evolve over time, and that love sometimes means making difficult decisions that no one is entirely happy with. The house on Maple Street was gone, along with the illusion that family relationships are simple and unchanging. But in its place, we began to build something more honest and sustainable. A family structure that acknowledged the realities of aging while preserving the dignity and voice of every member, even when those voices sometimes forget what they said yesterday. The money from the house sale gave me the independence to choose my own living situation and care options as my needs changed. But perhaps more importantly, the crisis of selling it forced all of us to have conversations we had been avoiding about aging, death, family responsibility, and the price of taking love for granted. My children learned that inheritance is not a right, but a gift that can be revoked when relationships break down. I learned that asking for help is not the same as giving up control, and that admitting vulnerability can sometimes lead to greater strength rather than less. The woman who sold her house to teach her children a lesson was not the same woman who moved into a new home with a clearer understanding of what she needed from her family and what she was willing to give in return. Both versions of me were necessary for the transformation that saved not just my independence, but the relationships that still mattered most in my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.